Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Safest Family on the Block, where knowledge is power. My name's Jason, and joining me today is Jim O'Brien of the Self-Initiative Project. Good morning, sir.
Hey, good morning, Jason. Thanks for having me on. Happy to be here.
Absolutely my pleasure. I think the listeners and viewers are in for a real treat. And let's just start a little bit about why that is. Tell us a bit about who you are, what you do, and how you got here.
Yeah, so I don't like to talk a lot about myself. I'll keep it as brief as I possibly can. So I say it all the time. I consider myself an average Joe, but I have taken the initiative, I guess, to seek out training and learn an awful lot of different things in the personal safety and preparedness space specifically. So the Self-Initiative Project I founded solely on the premise for those that want to take responsibility for their own personal safety and preparedness. And that's kind of how we got here. A lot of safety tips, or try to keep a lot of safety tips posted on Instagram, and we run a podcast as well. So just trying to disseminate some information that's stuck upstairs in the old noggin.
Outstanding. And folks, go take a look at his Instagram feed and his podcast. As he says, there's daily safety tips and safety topics, little snatches of his own advice there in video as well. It's got a lot of stuff, which is what brought us together. We met over Instagram.
Yeah.
And I needed to get some of that information on the show.
Sure.
And to start the conversation, we were talking before about the broad spectrum of stuff that we could talk about today, but very specifically about preparing and planning for dangerous situations and for staying safe in situations ranging from a natural catastrophe to an attempted mugging to a home invasion to fire. Yeah. And preparing for that requires a plan.
Yeah.
And there's one thing about plans that an uncle of mine he was in Marine Force Recon used to say all the time. This has just always stuck with me, which is a plan that you don't rehearse is not a plan.
Yeah.
It's what you hope might happen.
Yeah. No, I saw that interestingly enough most recently on your Instagram, and I was like, yeah, that's great. Like, no plan at all if you don't have one, or if you don't rehearse it ahead of time, right? Same with scenarios, the importance of thinking through scenarios before something happened, just to have a game plan in place and know what you might do, right or wrong. Those that think through things ahead of time or have a plan put in place ahead of time are far better off than those that don't, for sure.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is important to kind of remember about that is the person you are when you're comfortable, you're on the deck at a dojo, you're at the range for a class, you're at home talking to your family about what you're going to do if this thing happens. That person is far, far smarter than the adrenaline charged person in the situation. And so when a bad thing is happening, is not when you want to be thinking about how to solve it. It's when you want to be implementing the plan you made when you were comfortable and safe and far, far smarter than they are in that instance.
Ahead of time. And, in the overall scheme of things, I say this all the time, in the overall scheme of things, bad things happen very rarely, right? So the good news with that and putting together a plan is you've got an awful lot of time to do that, right? And to think through those scenarios and get it in your head what it is you're going to do, and get your family on board with it as well. And that's kind of what we're here today to talk about as well.
Absolutely. And on that topic, one of the biggest things that I experienced when I talk to parents about planning for family safety, planning with our kids, getting our kids involved, is that fear that by talking about this thing, by sitting down with your 7-year-old and going through and rehearsing a fire plan, for instance, or talking with your kids about what you're going to do if you're approaching the car at night and you see somebody who might be a bit of trouble coming towards you, that conversation will frighten them and have them grow up more afraid of the world or in a scarier, I don't know, viewpoint than if we just kind of left them in blissful ignorance. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, it's been said many times, right? Even schools, even corporations have a similar philosophy where we really want to avoid that topic because we might do more harm than good, to your point, scare everybody, right? Or instill fear. And look, as I just said, we're fortunate that with as many people on the planet as there are, and prescription medications being taken today, and bad family situations, whatever, that bad things don't happen more often than they don't. But the world is not all sunshine and roses, right? And I think the better that we prepare our children to face that world, even if it does get their attention. I don't know that we want to be scaring them, obviously, but we certainly want them to pay attention and to acknowledge the fact that, hey, these things can happen, and we as loving parents want them to be better prepared. And that's really what it all is. And then be available to answer their questions, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think another point that's valuable there is that by the time a kid's old enough to understand the safety talk and the plan you discuss with them, they've probably already thought about this situation. They've heard about it from their friends. They've seen it on the media. They've just speculated about it on their own. And so they're already aware. A 6-year-old is already aware that the house might have a fire in it. And from my perspective, is it better for them to not hear us talk about that at all, or for them to hear that, hey, there could be a fire? Here are the safety things in the house that keep that less likely and less dangerous. And here's the thought that I've put into it.
Yeah.
Mom and dad are on the case. And here's how you, little guy, can help.
Yeah. You make a really good point. Children today are more connected than ever. I know when I was growing up, I didn't have a smartphone, right? And there was no social media, thank goodness. Thank God there was no social media back when I was a kid growing up, or even in college days, right? But to your point, they're going to hear about these things. They're going to learn about them. And I think when it comes to important things like safety, whether it's fire or the bad guy knocking on the front door, or someone creeping around the car in the parking lot at the grocery store, whatever it is, I think it's better that they hear it from their parents than through those other outlets, which they're likely to hear about anyway, whether it's the mainstream media or all these social media channels that they're connected to. And if nothing else, their peers in school and the playground and wherever else are going to be talking about it as well. So we might as well be the ones doing it for them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's kind of walk through a little bit. Say I'm a person who's becoming more aware, more worried about dangers in the world, and got a couple of kids maybe in that early elementary age, and I need to come up with a fire plan.
Yeah.
Where would you start? Where would I start coming up with a fire plan for my family?
Wow. Great question. So if it were me, I would probably start talking in terms of escape routes, right? First and foremost. And possibly, since they are connected with smartphones, make sure they know how to use 911, right? Make sure they're aware of things of like giving the address first. While 911 has the ability to triangulate your location, not everybody is aware of this, but 911 has the ability to triangulate and get somewhat close to your vicinity, but they're not actually able to pinpoint exact location markers. So that's why it's important that we teach your kids to give that your address first. So, if hopefully your kids already know your full name, their address, and their phone number. And when we talk about 911, giving that address first and foremost. The escape plan is key. If fire's in the front of the house, where do I go? Is it a back door? Is it a window? Do we need to think about getting a ladder to drop down? What if we're upstairs in the house, right? And we can't get downstairs to the first floor doors. What are we going to do? What's the game plan? What window are we going to get out? Hopefully the lowest one to the ground, right? But if that's not possible, we might need to think about ladders and making sure we've practiced, to your point, not just talking about the plan and what window and magically there'll be a ladder in place, but actually using that ladder and making sure everybody can egress safely, right? And be familiar with that. Fire extinguishers, again, small children aren't going to be a lot of help there, but older children can certainly pick up a fire extinguisher. I know for me and what I would do when I went through the community emergency response team training, they taught us anything larger that can fit in a small office garbage can, or basically the size of a beach ball. If the fire was any bigger than that, to get out and call 911, right? Or call 911 as you're getting out, right? So, but knowing when to fight that fire potentially. And then, when it comes to fire extinguishers, remembering the acronym PASS, right? PASS. You pull the you pull the pin, you aim, you squeeze, and you sweep, right? And again, if you see that fire getting beyond that basic size that's safe, you want to get out. So talking, and there's a lot more details than that, but these are just kind of some of the high levels that come to mind when we talk about a fire plan. And then on top of that, once we get out of the house, what do we do? Do we know where to go? Are we going to meet in the backyard, or are we going to meet down on the street on the sidewalk and make sure everybody's gathered up there while we wait on 911 to arrive? So there's a lot of different elements to that piece when it comes to fire. But certainly, again, with the theme that we're here to talk about today, having that plan, making sure everybody is aware of that plan and understands, and then practicing executing on that plan as well. And, when it comes to kids, maybe they each have a role. Maybe Johnny calls 911, maybe Susie grabs the ladder and unrolls it out the window. I'm making up stuff, obviously, but whatever it is, assigning roles and responsibilities, I think is key to that too. So they have a part, and it kind of helps maybe keep them more grounded in the situation as well.
And I think that also is a strong antidote to the fear factor of it, because it's not fire scary and can kill you, it's fire scary and can kill you, and here is what you will personally do in the event of a fire.
Yeah.
One thing that I noticed that you were talking about was the idea of a go, no go situations. Like if the fire is of this size, get out of there.
Get out.
And in any kind of safety plan we make, that kind of that kind of mental flow chart, very simple, I think can be very, very helpful. Because in the minute, a lot of guys, especially, they'll take a look at a fire in the kitchen and go, hell, I can take this, right?
Yeah.
Because that's the way we are. Or they might get into that repetitive motion that often happens and keep blasting away at it without having that metric in their mind. And having those previously discussed, researched, drop dead points, whatever, for every scenario. A good friend of mine is a scuba diver, and and she and her husband are very experienced scuba divers, scuba trainers. The husband was trained initially in the military, very competent, very, very good at what they do, but they also have almost very tame seeming go, no go points that they write down before each dive. And for a while there, because the husband was a little more of a daredevil, she made him sign it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, no, I can relate to that. I dive too. And, I dive a lot of times. You don't know who you're going to wind up with, not to get off track too much, but you don't know who you're going to wind up on a boat with, right? And so you may have an expert and you're a beginner like myself, right? And you need to have some kind of plan ahead of time before you get in that water, because they're going to be wanting to do things that you may not be ready to do. And that's, tying that back into the fire thing too, right? Is also, when you think about that plan and when you're assigning roles, making sure whoever is comfortable with those roles and can practice them and not be overly intimidated. And going back to the size of the fire real quick, I want to point out too, the reason why that size is so important and knowing when to get out is because a fire can double in size every 30 seconds. Well, if you've got a small kitchen fire or a fire in the garage, that can become a pretty serious thing pretty quickly, right? And sneak up on you. So to your point, you might get hung up in blasting that chemical powder everywhere and playing firefighter, but you really have to have the maturity and the preparedness in your head to get out when that time gets there. So we could talk more about fire for sure.
But but all of that is very important. Again, it kind of underscores the importance of making that decision when you're not full of adrenaline,
Yeah.
when you're sitting comfortable, and then trusting that person who
Yeah.
was smarter than you. Another thing I wanted to bring up about getting kids involved in, the older kids, tweens and teens, on fire extinguishers. This is something that we've done in our family. Longtime listeners will have heard this before, but we just get a suite of the cheap $20 Home Depot replacement every couple year fire extinguishers.
Yeah.
And we get them once a year, just before the 4th of July. And every year, the new ones come in, the old ones come out. We build a campfire on the back patio, and everybody in the house
That's a
does
great
the
plan.
thing.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And that's a good point too, is part of that fire plan,
Mhm.
going back to our plan for our family, is
Yeah.
inspecting the fire extinguishers. Hopefully you have a
Mhm.
fire extinguisher in your house, at least one, right? In the
Yeah.
kitchen, the garage, and maybe your main master suite, or the room that
Mhm.
you deem the safe room, right?
Yeah.
And then it's important that you maintain and inspect those fire extinguishers. So that means, for example, making sure that the needle is remaining in the green zone.
Yeah.
Fire extinguishers, I know some of the kids, and I guess they're all probably the same, even the powder
Mhm.
chemical ones, have a 5-year expiration, right? So, I'm not going to tell you that you need to throw them away, but that's just something to keep in mind. And you
Yeah.
certainly want to keep a check on them at least annually to make sure that needle is in the green. And then for the powdered chemicals, and just talked about this recently on
Yeah.
our Instagram page, is you need to turn them upside down and give them a good shake, because those powders will
Mm.
settle over time, which is going to
Mm.
make it next to impossible to jet out of there, even
Mhm.
while the contents is under pressure. It's going to make it more difficult if that powder gets settled. So shaking
Mhm.
those extinguishers on a regular basis is a good idea
Yeah.
too. And then to your point, I think that's a fantastic idea. Get the family involved. If you got a fire pit in the backyard, or even a grill, nothing says you can't get those fire extinguishers that are maybe borderline time to
Mhm.
expire. Think about getting new ones, and use that time to practice and use that pass. Remember that pass acronym.
No, that's
Great idea.
excellent. And this fire plan that we've kind of discussed here forms a very good template for any other kind of emergency preparation. You sit down, you recognize what's going on, what the threats are, you take a look at who's involved, where it's going to happen, what the best plan is. You look at what kind of equipment you might need,
Yeah.
you assign roles, and then you practice it. And
Yeah.
so we could take the same thing and look at uh, you know, mom and a couple of younger kids walking out of the mall at night, and there's some sketchy people kind of around the car, and having discussed that ahead of time, who's involved, mom and the kids, where is it? It's a dark parking lot. What equipment do we have? Does mom have her conceal and carry? Is she, a fourth-degree black belt? Does she have pepper spray? Uh, is the plan just to go back inside and find security and get them to walk you out?
Yeah.
And walk through that step by step
Yeah.
for whatever kind of safety situation you might encounter.
Yeah, that's a great
Yeah.
point. Going back to our thinking through scenarios, not
Mhm.
just a fire
Yeah.
plan in the house, but
Mhm.
any sorts of scenarios, whether it's home invasion, or
Yeah.
getting pinned between the car and the gas pump at the gas station, which isn't good, right? But
Yeah.
just to kind of stick with the home theme
Yeah.
for a moment,
Mhm.
and taking that fire plan, to your point, and extending it further.
Mhm.
What about tornadoes?
Yeah.
The difference between a tornado and a fire plan is that you're probably not going to go outside if there's a tornado,
No.
right? You're going to talk about getting to that
Mhm.
basement, or getting to that centermost room furthest away from the windows, that
Mhm.
sort of thing. And then walking through that and grabbing the
Mhm.
flashlights, or the emergency, wind up, I always think
Yeah.
of the monkey grinder,
Yeah.
wind up weather radio to have in there
Mhm.
with you, right? That kind of plan, where it's polar opposite of a fire plan.
Mhm.
And then just in general safety, everybody, I think there's this romance with CQB, close quarter combat, and clearing your home, and working, pieing off
Mhm.
angles. All of that's super cool, and that's great knowledge to have. I've done it, and I'm sure you have too. But the realities are, is a family really going to be pieing off and squaring off their bedrooms? Probably not. So have you thought about a safe room? What happens if someone kicks in the door in the middle of the night, or you hear the alarm go off in the middle of the night? What's the family's game plan? Is there a toddler in a separate bedroom? Do you have a safe room? You talked about equipment, making sure you've got your cell phone in there, your car keys, maybe some glow sticks just in case, right? A spare house key that when you're sure the law enforcement's on the scene, you can throw the spare key out the back window so they can get in if someone's in your house. Just as an example, these are some of the things. Keeping a photocopy of your driver's license so you can prove it's your residence, right? And you're not the bad guy. Just these sorts of things. And then what are the kids doing? Do they know to make their way to the safe room? If it's a toddler, you might have to go with your firearm, if you so choose, whatever your game plan is, and go get that toddler and bring it back to the safe room. So all these things play into this planning you're talking about. And then when you've got family members involved, working the plan, executing the plan ahead of time, whether that's once or twice a year, whatever it may be. But there's all kinds of scenarios that could happen at the house, right?
Yeah. And one of the important things I think for families especially is you go to work and there's the emergency binder on the wall somewhere. And it's about that thick, and every single incident has its own specific plan. Yeah. And we don't want to do that, especially if we have kids, because they're not going to remember the nuances and details.
No.
For our house, we have two plans: the bug in and the bug out. And not to give too much information, but we live in a sprawling ranch home with 3 glass sliders in the back and big picture windows. Our house is tactically porous.
Yeah.
Right. And we decided also that between that and the fact that we don't really own anything that's worth hurting somebody over. So our home invasion plan is identical to our fire plan.
Sure.
Everybody get the hell out, go to the neighbors.
Yeah.
And that's for us, and other families have other situations. For example, if we lived in a 2-story house and the kids couldn't necessarily crawl out, we might have a different home invasion plan. But it's either a bug out plan where we all know exactly get out through the nearest window, right? Reconvene at the neighbors. We're close with them as a big sprawling family, some of whom are also fairly active, action-oriented people. So if bad guys were to follow us there, they would be very, very sad bad guys. They'd be very sad bad guys. Or that we need to gather in the master bedroom and in the event of a natural catastrophe. Although we're out here in the Pacific Northwest where our weather doesn't really mean it, natural catastrophes are very rare up here.
Yeah.
But the point being, 2 plans, just 2, not 17 plans for 17 different situations.
Yeah, and you bring up a couple of good points, I think, indirectly in all that you just said, in that, we're talking about some things today, whether it's about fire or safe rooms or tornadoes or whatever, and we're talking about things you might consider and things that you need to do. But your situation, whether you live alone or you're with a family or your spouse, no kids, or with kids or 6 kids, whatever, everyone's plan is going to be a little bit different. So what my plan is for my situation and in my home, my property, and the layout of my home, it necessarily might be or is going to be different than your game plan. So there's not a one size fits all for everybody. The point of this conversation is just to get folks to think through what they might do and what's appropriate and best for them. And then, I think another great point that you made is, you can't give your kids a bulleted 30-point list of things that's going to happen or that they need to consider, or that they need to take care of when something bad does happen. But I think that's a good reason why it might help to give specific tasks to individuals, right? To keep them focused and to keep them from being completely overwhelmed, and then say, hey, look, once you've done your assigned task, once you've dialed 911, then your next task, if you can get to it, is to grab the first aid kit, and break it down into digestible chunks so they're not completely scared and they're not completely overwhelmed, right? In the time that they need to act.
And to make those tasks, again, have as few start points as possible, where it's either this plan or that plan. If you're out and about on vacation or in the world, having 1 or 2 plans for as many scenarios as possible. One that I ran into fairly recently, this came from Spencer Corson, the guy who wrote The Safety Trap, came out about a year ago. was having just kind of the general plan. If things go wrong, we meet back at the last place we ate.
Yeah.
And that's for any time you're traveling, you're going wandering around in Paris, whatnot, and you might get separated. You might not be sure. And then just have that, or you're at the county fair. And most people can remember, oh yeah, we had elephant ears a half an hour ago.
Yeah.
And then that can be a thing that is consistent but changeable in the situation.
Yeah.
And it's just those little things like that can make the plans much more effective.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up another great point, is meeting places when you're out and about, like we talked about in the fire scenario. Maybe your game plan, for whatever reason, your neighborhood, or maybe you're on a giant piece of property, so it doesn't matter so much. Maybe the backyard is the best meetup point, right? Or it could be my situation, could be the sidewalk down front and at the mailbox, right? If you're at Disney World, where are you going to be? Is it going to be Space Mountain, or is it going to be in front of that restaurant we just ate at? Is it easier to remember and get to the restaurant, or is it easier to remember to go to Cinderella's castle and stand out front, or Space Mountain and stand out front? So having a regroup, either as a timed meetup point in place, right? Or if something bad happens, knowing what to do if you are all separated, right?
Yeah. And it all goes back to that, having that plan ahead of time, taking the time to talk it over, to look in the eye, the things that could go wrong, and then talk to everybody in the group to the degree that they're able to. One of the things I remember when we, longtime listeners will know this, but when my kids were 4 and 14 and then turning 5 and 15, we went and spent the year in Malaysia just so my kids could know what it's like to live somewhere other than the United States, right? The oldest one, still, we joke about how great it is not to have to boil our water, right? But that plan had situations where we're traveling in fairly sketchy parts of the world. And, the 14-year-old's job, my wife at the time she was a white woman who got a black belt in Japan. So she was not a badass. But if we were to be attacked, the older kid's job was to grab the 4-year-old and run like hell to the rally point while mom and dad, dealt with the situation however was necessary, whether that was running right behind him or doing some kind of holding action or whatnot. But you can find those roles, and the 4-year-old knew that if we used the code word, his job was to climb his brother like a monkey, right? And then hold on. And so those kind of things where we're dealing with very scary things, but as you say, giving each child a specific useful task that they can remember and do is huge.
And knowing what to do in a given situation, like God forbid small children get separated from their parents, right? And using the Disney World, Disneyland, Six Flags, whatever amusement park example again, someone gets separated. Do they know who they should find? Do they know where to go? Like finding adults with children is a good place to start, right? Or going to the uniformed officer that has badges and flags all over their, teaching them who to look for so they can get help should they find themselves separated from you. And, touching upon what you just mentioned was the notion of safe words, right? There's a lot of great ones out there. I won't even try to drop them now because I don't want to use anybody's idea, but I have one that my significant other in the past and my friends know, and if I ever say it, they know to get away from me and call 911 because it's about to go down, right? Whatever that looks like. But they know to get away from me and they know to dial 911. So safe words have a great place in a family safety plan too. And I would encourage folks to think about the safety word and make sure that it's something that is so obnoxious or so rarely used or it is going to be completely out of context when it gets used that they'll recognize it immediately. And secondly, and is equally important, if not more important, knowing what to do when they hear it, right?
Ours for the very longest time was, hey, is that Aunt Lorna? Up until 10 years ago,
Yeah.
Aunt Lorna lived in Nagasaki.
Yeah.
It was not going to be Aunt Lorna,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
also for us, we're also indicating the direction of the threat,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
But that's an example of a safe word, or just say pomegranates, and everybody knows time to go. But that's what you're talking about here when we mean safe words.
Yeah.
Kind
How
of
many
coding.
times are you going to yell out pomegranate randomly, completely out of context, not in the
Yeah.
grocery store or eating one, right? So those are
Exactly.
the types of safe words or safe word phrases, as you mentioned, that you want to think about. And then
Yeah.
again, the more important piece is to have that game plan in place where everybody knows what the expectations are.
And that gets back to having that plan in a family meeting, probably for families. Have it first with the spouse, the partner, just working it out together, and then bringing in the kids and assigning tasks, getting their feedback. And those conversations are also a really good opportunity, I think, to talk to them about, hey, what worries you, buddy? What's on your mind? What else should we make a plan for?
Yeah.
And it might be a dinosaur attack, but hey, figured out a dinosaur attack isn't a bad use of your time.
It's one more scenario you might want to think about, right?
Yeah, do you remember back during
better the zombie apocalypse? I'm not sure which one's more viable, but both might be fun to explore, if nothing else.
Do you remember back? I think this was during the Bush administration. The department, FEMA's website had a zombie apocalypse survival guide PDF you could get down, where they disseminated and it was for any given natural catastrophe, but they wrapped it around a zombie apocalypse because they knew people would read that more.
Yeah. Yeah, they did. I remember that very well, because there was a handful of folks that actually thought it was real, which always amazes me, but that might actually make it that much more fun and that much more memorable.
Yeah. And if another 10,000 people stock a little extra food and water and get some medical training and they otherwise wouldn't, I call that a win.
Yeah. A random thought that just popped into my mind and is first aid. And, obviously the small children aren't going to be a lot of help there, but I think it's so important. In the spirit of transparency, I learned most of my early fire skills, blade handling, safety skills in my first aid in the Boy Scouts of America. And I still use a lot of those skills that I learned back then, believe it or not. When I go camping, it's amazing how much stuff I still employ today that I learned when I was a kid back then. But I think the earliest that you think that your child is capable of remembering or mature enough, whatever, only you know that, is to get them trained in at least basic. Now, do they need to be doing CPR and running AEDs? Maybe if they're old enough, right? But the soonest that you can get them trained to know what to do, first aid kit, I think that's a valuable lesson in the family safety space that I wish more people participated in.
Absolutely. And for adults as well, in the last 10-15 years or so, the what's the word? Not transparency, the availability of advanced medical training to lay people has really increased. Like in the 90s and the 2000s, it was your first aid class, maybe an advanced first aid class, and then you had to go get like an EMT course or something. But these days they have the Stop the Bleed training, which is free in most places. Then you can go do a backwoods medicine course for about $1,200 in a weekend. And $1,200 sounds like a lot, but let's admit it, a lot of people watching this show have already seriously considered spending that much on a new rifle, on an additional rifle.
Probably
this year.
So.
Right?
If not, it's on layaway.
Yeah, right. And at that backwoods medicine course, for that, you're going to use that information way more likely than using your third backup piece.
Yeah. I completely agree. I think, before we learn, and this is a little on sidebar, but I think it's important that before we learn weapons training and all of that stuff, that there's a viable place like situational awareness and de-escalation, which I know we haven't gotten in today, but there is just as
Yeah.
much, if not more,
Mm,
need to learn that basic first aid than if you can
mm,
CPR. And then, as you mentioned, Stop the Bleed's a fantastic program that's generally free in most areas now, I think, or if it's not, it's certainly growing, to your point. Not promoting the Boy
mm,
Scouts by any means, but just saying, I remember getting early
mm,
first aid skills there, even learning how to use a bandana for an arm brace,
mm,
a makeshift tourniquet, whatever it is, and then going to the American Red
mm,
Cross to get certified in CPR, even back in
mm,
the day, because I did some lifeguarding when I was a kid, right?
mm,
So I had to have that basic CPR knowledge. And of course, it's evolved. And whether
mm,
you go, another fantastic skill to know and have, and I'll give you a story here lately why it is important. Is both the American Red Cross
mm,
and the American Heart Association put on first aid and CPR and AED training, and you can do it all the way
mm,
from you can just focus on adults, or you can also do both infants
mm.
and adults. And learning how to use an AED is invaluable as well.
Yeah.
I know when I went through my community emergency response training, they also did first aid
Mm,
there. Now, that was totally different. They really didn't consider CPR or the use of tourniquets at the time, but
mm,
just learning some of that, dealing with severe bleeding, right, in
mm,
whatever capacity. And again, the Stop the Bleed program, which your listeners should look into in their area, is fantastic to
mm,
learn basic trauma care, as I understand, and at least as I've touted numerous times when talking about it. Severe bleeding, hemorrhaging is the number one cause of preventable deaths in trauma cases.
mm,
So having that basic first aid, or even not so basic trauma care, is paramount, I think, for anyone.
mm,
And I'm always fascinated when I learn that people don't know very much, if anything, about those things, and how many people just won't take initiative to get it for themselves. My buddy and I were doing some long distance shooting more recently. And at the safety brief before the day started, before everybody went off and started doing their thing on the range, it was asked, how many people here have basic first aid or CPR training, and how many people have basic trauma care? Aside from one nurse who, if I remember right, was a dermatologist nurse, or however you say that,
mm,
I was the only person on site that had those skills and that ability. So I made it a point to sync up with her, because she was down the other side of the firing line from where I was, and said, "Hey, I'm here if you need me, and I've got gear on board. Let's
mm.
find each other if something happens," right? But
Yeah.
the point of that is that she and I were the only ones that could have done anything, and we're out in the middle of nowhere on 2,300 acres, right? So
Mm,
we're probably going to have to life flight somebody in there just to get to us to help if something did go wrong. So those skills are invaluable, and I know I've harped on that a lot, but that's something that doesn't
mm,
require learning how to use a knife or a gun, or even martial arts skills, or related, right? Is something that we
mm.
can all do and should.
And also something that you're going to use more often
Yeah.
is because, training in any kind of violence, martial arts, shooting, what have you, you use if you were violently attacked, which in North America is vanishingly rare. But first aid training, as a parent, I mean, if you've managed to get your kid all the way to 18 or 21 without at least one ER visit, I can't figure out whether I'm proud of you or disappointed.
Right. Have you done something right or something wrong?
Yeah,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
and that's oh, wait a second. My train of thought just left the tracks. That's something about the medical training at a shooting event. That's
Yeah.
hugely important. When I had a license back in the 90s when I worked in a profession that had you carry, and then there was a long time I didn't, and then I was considering doing it again. Talked to a friend of mine who's a SWAT team instructor, big man with big guns, kind of almost central
Yeah. Yeah.
casting kind of dude. And so I asked him for some advice about that. And the first thing he said, and what he said to me first is, "Do you have a trauma kit in the house, and do you have trauma medicine training? Because if you don't have those, I'm not going to encourage you to have a firearm in the house." And I
Yeah.
was like, "Hmm." And this is a guy who you really would not have expected that from, but he's absolutely right. And that medical training is probably the thing I would recommend most to parents. And to your point, that is more absent in
Yeah.
a lot of families beyond the, I think a lot of us got that basic first aid just because a job made us do it once.
Yeah.
But how long ago was that? And is that up to the task of the dangers that our kids might face?
Yeah, absolutely. And
Mm.
there's merit in having the boo-boo bag, right? The first aid
Yeah.
kit. But I think especially when you are better prepared to face violence, whether it's active shooter or you just going to the firing range on the weekends, having some more of advanced skills with some of those supplies and gears that are
Yeah.
meant for the trauma, the severe bleeding. That's kind of a different level of first aid, if you will. Having those skills, especially if you're in that circle, so to speak, is key. Absolutely.
And to kind of bring this back to planning, that's another stage we can put into creating a family safety plan where we're talking about who's involved, where it's happening, what needs to happen, what equipment do we have, and then also, okay, what skills do we have and what skills do we wish we had?
Yeah.
As we're walking through that, whether it's that fire plan and you're going, well, I used a fire extinguisher once at a corporate training 6 years ago, but I haven't touched one since, and none of the kids have tried it, all the way up to both parents are professional working firefighters.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or the first aid skills, and skills like how do you open the window in the house in the middle of the night? How does that screen pop out? All those. And so as we go through that planning, we can also make a list of our assets in terms of what we need to do, and also get a checklist for classes to take in the next year.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Very cool. Well, Jim, thank you so much for taking the time today. Before I let you go, though, what's a topic that you don't get enough opportunity to talk to people about?
I knew you were going to ask me that. I had it in my notes because I think that was the very first thing you'd mentioned to me is we need to talk about this, or said we wanted to talk about this. And I was like, yeah. And I was like, this is really easy to answer. And I think it's another way of asking the question I've asked several of my guests that have come on. And that is, how being in this community, doing what it is we're trying to do, getting the information out that we're trying to get out, at least that's what I'm trying to do, right? Like, how can we get more people invested in their personal safety? And everywhere from Kelly Sayre, the Diamond Arrow Group, to Tony Blauer have all said, whoever it is have all said, that's a great question, man. If we could get that figured out, we'd be rolling in the dough. To answer your question directly, I think the thing that I wish people would ask me more is just engage on the subject matter, right? Like whether it's Instagram or shooting me an email or whatever. Ask questions, reach out, don't be afraid. The knowledge will not hurt you, it will only help. And yeah, it's scary topics sometimes, things we don't want to address or face, but just engage. I don't always point preparedness tips or safety tips or whatever, but when I do, if you're not clear on something, ask a question, whatever it is. So I don't think there's a specific topic so much as I just wish people would engage more and think about taking responsibility for those things for themselves and their families.
No, I absolutely agree. And I'm probably preaching to the choir to anybody who's made it this far into a family safety podcast, but absolutely agree that we should engage. And also, almost everybody I've met who works in this sphere are the nicest, most giving people. They're not scary. They answer questions. We're huge nerds about the topic and are just sitting there waiting for somebody to ask us. So don't be afraid to go to any expert on the subject and ask. They'll almost certainly answer.
Yeah, and to top that off, I'll say this. I'm and don't take it as a negative thing. I'm not former LE, I'm not former law enforcement or military. I don't have either as a background, right? As I said in the opening, I'm an average Joe, but I've made it a point to acquire a lot of different knowledge, and so can everyone else, right? don't think that my point of that is that
Mm.
don't think that you have to be some significant figure of authority in order to be a viable source of information for you. So reach out to folks like Jason and I and ask your questions as you have them.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again, Jim, for coming on. Tell everybody real quick, once again, where they can find you and your channel and your information.
Yeah, so you can find me at the Self Initiative Project on Instagram, and my podcast is hosted on Podbean, but you can find me at podcast.theselfinitiativeproject.com.
Outstanding. Well, thanks again, sir. Thank you, everybody, for watching. See you next time.
Thanks a lot for having us.